Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. Welcome to the WIT chat. My name is Ricardo, and today we have invited to an expert in the analysis of animal behavior to talk about something that is fundamental in training of marine mammals, the L.R.S or lesson reinforcement scenario. He's the Dr. Eduardo Fernandez. Eduardo Fernandez received his PhD in psychology, minors in neuroscience and animal behavior from Indiana University, where he worked with the Indianapolis and the Cincinnati Zoo. He received his master in behavior analysis from the University of North Texas, where he founded the Organization for Reinforcement Contingencies with Animals, ORCA. Most of his past and current work involves behavioral research applied to the welfare and training of zoo, aquariums, and companion animals. He is currently a senior lecturer of applied animal behavior and welfare in the School of Animal and Veterinary Science at the University of Adelaide, Australia. His past positions included a visiting professorship in the School of Behavior Analysis at the Florida Institute of Technology, a research fellowship with the Woodland Park Zoo, and National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellowship. He started the Behavioral Enrichment Animal Research Group, which conducted welfare research with many of the species and exhibits located throughout the zoo. He currently runs to the Operant Welfare Lab, which is dedicated to use of learning principles to improve the lives of animals across the many settings, including exotic animals in zoos, companion animals in homes, and agriculture animals in farms. Many of his past publications, research projects, and presentations can be found in the ResearchGate profile. We're going to put the link in the video description later. Eduardo, how are you? Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, good. I'm very good. We're in very different time zones. It's late for you. It's afternoonish for me, but we're making it work.
Yes. It's, I understand you are in California right now.
It's Seattle in Washington, so
right.
Just north of California. Yeah, waiting to move to Australia.
Right.
So that's the main thing. Yeah.
Long way. I would like to ask you something. Where and when did the motivation to dedicate yourself to the study of animal behavior come from, Doctor?
Yeah, this is always a weird, complicated question. I'm going to simplify it as easily as I can. So I grew up, for the most part. I'm a Philly kid originally, so from Philadelphia. But I grew up most of my childhood or later childhood and teenage years were in South Florida. And we're talking about it in the 80s and 90s, when South Florida was still under a lot of development, especially Western South Florida, where I grew up. So outside of Fort Lauderdale. So I spent a lot of time as a preteen and then teenager, even getting to doing a lot of chasing of snakes and lizards and alligators, and I mean that too, chasing of alligators. So spent quite a bit of time around some of the wildlife there, even the occasional armadillo, and a lot of the neat wildlife we had around the Everglades, since I spent a lot of time out in the Everglades. And that was really a big passion. It sparked a lot of passion for me. I mean, some people are always surprised to hear that I was a reptile kid. That was my big interest, and somehow I just kind of grew into mammals, and then and later birds. Yeah, that was the big inspiration, was just getting to have so much close access to so much interesting wildlife. By the time I was finishing my undergraduate degree, I was really torn between my interest in behavior and my interest in animals. It still, even as I was finishing my undergraduate degree, it still hadn't really dawned on me that I could do both, that I could study behavior and animals. I had planned on going into clinical psychology, And I just happened to luck out. I mean, I was planning on doing some form of applied work with humans. I just happened to luck out that I ended up in a master's program that there had been just one thesis that was getting done at that time, working with animals in that master's program, and that faculty supervisor happened to be uh, allow that student to do this master's work. They didn't have much experience with animals themselves, and I just turned to them and said, why don't we start an applied animal behavior lab? And they didn't really take me all that seriously. And I came back a week later with a list of student names who would be part of the lab. And I said, no, 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 I want to start this applied animal behavior lab. Something that really had not been done specifically in behavior analysis up until that point. I guess I just went out on a limb and did this. And he said, okay, I guess you're going to start this lab. So that was, I haven't turned back since then. That was really the big start, was that was creating the Organization for Reinforcement Contingencies with Animals, or ORCA, in 2000 so just over 20 years ago. Right at the start of my master's, I just kept doing more and more research with a focus on the welfare of animals under all these strange settings. So behavioral welfare.
Amazing, Doctor. In your words, in this time, you have 20 years really deeper in this. In your opinion, what is the importance of the analysis of the animal behavior nowadays, considering the current position of the zoos and marine mammal industry in the world?
Yeah, so I really think we're in a very interesting time now, where there's so much more focus on the welfare of animals under all settings, right? So not just in zoos and aquariums, but in homes. You know, people are considerably more interested in things like enrichment, in having a deeper understanding of what it means to care for the welfare of their animals. I jokingly say, when I talk to my mom, when I talk to family members, my mom, if somebody asks her, what does your son do for a living? She's like, oh, he makes penguins happy. And I'm not sure that's not accurate. But that's a big part when somebody asks me if I'm a simplified understanding of welfare. I say, look, we're trying to improve the lives of animals. Now, I happen to focus on behavioral welfare. I do a little bit with physiological welfare as well, not much, but I happen to focus on behavior. And from a behavior analytic perspective, that typically means looking at observable, measurable behavior. Because at the end of the day, for me, I want to show changes in behavior based on the things that I'm doing. So I need to be able to measure those changes. That's really one of the biggest benefits of behavior analysis, is that we can measure these changes. So, and then people ask me, well, what do you focus on? Well, we look at the things we want animals to be doing. How do we know that an animal is doing well? How do I know a penguin is doing well in an exhibit, in an aquarium or zoo exhibit? Well, they should be spending quite a bit of their time swimming. That's a big part. That's one of the main measures. And so I've published a couple studies with penguins now, where the main measure we've used is increasing swim time, since there's almost always a need to increase swim time. When we get to some other, penguins are a little bit easier, because that's you can really look at that one main metric of swim time and look at increasing swim time. When you're talking about some of the felids or ursids, so the cats and the bears, they can be a little more, you have a lot more things that you want to work on. So we might work on increasing amount of time foraging as well and being active. But there may also be things that we want to see less of, like some of the pacing or behavior, being inactive in general. So that's really what it comes down to, is just finding ways to improve the lives of animals through directly observable, measurable behaviors. And that's not that much different than what we're trying to do with training. Whether we're talking about training dogs or training dolphins, or a big part of that is getting these behaviors that we'd like to see more of. So they're very directly interconnected.
Yeah, true, true. I was not so long time ago to found your research in the habits of immersion in hippos and correspondence for the temperature of the water. So interesting that.
Yeah.
And it's take me out many bad conceptions about the hippos before. So interesting. Let's talk about a little bit about the training. Now you to touch this topic.
Yeah.
When we speak about the trainer, or when we speak about the positive or negative reinforcement, what we are doing specific is speak about the type of the contingents that the response must maintain in a given context or with a given consequence. When the contingence is negative and the response becomes as a consequence to this process, we speak about the negative reinforcement procedure. If consequence is positive, we speak a positive reinforcement process. Can you explain to us what is a contingency, and if we can consider it an animal as a contingent during the whole development of a training session, Doc?
Yeah. So contingencies itself are probably one of the most important components of understanding behavior, all behavior, whether we're talking about including aspects of behavior that are not directly related, well, that are, everything's directly related to learning, but including aspects of behavior that are more directly influenced by, say, the biology or evolutionary history of the organism, or if we're talking about respondent or operant conditioning, so learning behavior, contingencies are still very relevant. This is how we understand the emergence of behavior in an environment. So that's a big part of what we're doing to define a contingency, is it's really the relationship of response to the environment. We have particular ways in behavior analysis. So when we talk about operant conditioning, that we talk about contingencies, since that's where you're going to hear the term most often. You will hear it less so when talking about respondent conditioning, or say other elicited non-conditioned responses. So if we're talking about things that are more directly related to ethology, you will hear, but the contingencies are still very much relevant, because we're just talking about, in many cases, the interaction between a behavior and the environment. Because we don't have, behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. So behavior occurs within an environment. So that's a contingency, is that relationship between the behavior and the environment. Some people have talked about it as an if-then statement. So this is more directly related to operant conditioning. So if this behavior occurs, then this consequence, or if this consequence follows that behavior becomes more likely. So we can talk about that to some extent, contingencies as if-then statements. But again, I like to emphasize that contingencies are important for all behavior as they emerge in an environment. So it's that relationship between the environment.
Right.
So that said, from an operant, so from the learning perspective that I think most trainers are most interested in, we can talk about the different contingencies. And in this case, now we're talking about so mostly we're talking about a 3-term contingency. That's of main interest. We could also talk about 2-term contingencies and 4-term contingencies and so on, but for our sake, we're going to just talk about the 3-term contingency, how behavior interacts with the environment within operant conditioning. And that's easily stated as the ABC, right? So antecedent, behavior, consequence. So that's the ABC. That's the 3-term contingency. So the stuff that happens before some response, the response, and the stuff that happens after the response. So typically those antecedent stimuli in operant conditioning are what we're calling discriminative stimuli. So they're the cues, the prompts that allow. So if I say to a dog, sit, that's the cue or the discriminative stimulus for sitting. The dog sits, and then the dog gets the reward. There's the consequence. So now we've described a positive reinforcement contingency that adheres to this 3-term contingency. And there are the 4 main contingencies within behavior analysis that you've already briefly mentioned that we talk about, which refer to reinforcement and punishment, and then positive and negative with respect to reinforcement and punishment. And in this sense, positive and negative simply mean the addition or removal of some stimulus or event. And then reinforcement and punishment only refer to whether the behavior increases or decreases. So, and this is part of where we run into this problem, is because punishment as a term already brings in so much baggage, right? When we think of punishment, we tend to necessarily think of something bad. But from an operant perspective, all that punishment means is that this consequence followed some response, right? So whether we're talking about whether the consequence was added or removed, that's just the positive or negative aspect. But punishment itself just means that some consequence followed some response, and that response in the future, so the future occurrence of that response became less likely to occur. That's it. So
it's true the thing that you say about the vision of the trainers, for example, for the main interest for the trainers is learning and extinction. This is the main the principal ways, and obviously the ethical and moral connotation of the work, in many sense, the negative or punish, is present all the time. I would like to start with the word contingents and your definition of contingents, because for us the L.R.S or lasting reinforcement scenario is affected to directly to the contingents. One definition of the L.R.S is a positive and proactive alternative to punishment designed to help animals learn and calm response to incorrect behavior and reduce trainer frustration. Mike Scarpuzzi and others in the MATA conference in 1991 in Concord, California, say a modified timeout was developed in a form a neutral response, a type of last reinforcement stimulus, L.R.S. I heard the L.R.S for first time in 1998, 1999, because in Mexico these terms obviously is not that soon than USA. When did you first hear the term L.R.S?
I would say probably, I mean, it was certainly the early part of the 21st century, probably. While I was doing some training of animals in, I was not officially doing any real applied animal behavior work until 99, 2000. 2000 when I had started in graduate school. That's when I started becoming academically interested in these things. So it was probably somewhere around let's say 2001. Probably one of the first times. That's by 2001, I was starting to have a lot of interactions with at that time Anheuser-Busch trainers, so SeaWorld, Busch Gardens, and I think by 2001 I was interacting with quite a number of the SeaWorld, again, what was Anheuser-Busch at that time ran all of the SeaWorld parks and Busch Gardens and so on. So that's when I started to become familiar with the term.
Yeah. According to the L.R.S revisited in the history L.R.S books, the one definition is the L.R.S is a proactive, specific extinction procedure based on differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, TRA. The trainer pauses 2 to 3 seconds following an incorrect response at the same point where reinforcement would have been applied following a correct response. The trainer response also functions as a stimulus for the animal to behave calm and attentive. We have here the extinction as a definition for the L.R.S. Extinction, according to Scarpuzzi and the others in 1991, is a procedure in which the reinforcement is no longer delivered for a previously reinforced response. What is your own definition of extinction, Doctor?
Yeah, so I'll back up a second real quick, because I think this is, there's an important history of the L.R.S. here that I am not as schooled on, as educated on some of this history. There are people that do a far better job of it, but I can detail at least a little bit of some of that history, which I think is important, which is going back, several decades, that some of these marine mammal trainers, in fact, going back even half a century plus, since we can go back to the Brelands and talk about some of the work that they were doing. So Keller and Marion Breland were doing with marine land, with dolphins. So some of the first real operant conditioning based training programs for dolphins. There was always this issue, and SeaWorld was one of the first big promoters of this work of using operant conditioning principles. And Thad Lesenik, who has written a book, Whale Done, on some of these issues that they encountered as well, which was, they got in pools with these animals, including orcas, and tried to use some of these traditional training methods, and they just simply got their butts kicked. I mean, large cetaceans are not going to deal with coming in there and trying to, quote unquote, be the alpha or whatnot, or use some of these, aversion-based training methods. So they had to focus pretty specifically on what they wanted to get, on rewarding the things they wanted to see. And that became a very important part of promoting that positive reinforcement training mentality. Karen Pryor came out of this background. She was training dolphins in the 70s and 80s. I am actually not sure about the timeline when Karen started. I think in the 70s as well. People like Gary Priest went on to start some of the operant conditioning training procedures, then with San Diego Zoo, that became very popular, now very common in zoos as well for husbandry purposes. So all this all stems back to the Brelands, but a big part of that was really this focus on positive reinforcement. That said, what became very and a very important component of that is to avoid as much use of punishment as possible. Now, I'm being very clear in saying what they were trying to do is avoid the use of punishment or aversive training procedures as much as possible. Part of what I'm saying there is that doesn't mean they were not using punishment or negative reinforcement. It means they were attempting to not use it as much. They were attempting to minimize the amount of aversive training, aversive conditioning, or even just a focus on getting rid of behavior as possible. So that helps give some of the background of the L.R.S. So where the L.R.S. came from is, that's a big part of it. There was a need to deal with behavior that was problematic for training. So you would see you'd go to start working with a dolphin or an orca or a sea lion or some other marine mammal, in many cases, often dolphins. They would do some behavior that might disrupt the training session otherwise, that might be problematic for continuing the training session. And you don't want to use some overt punishment procedure as might be more common for a traditional training corrective kind of method, right? So if we were talking about some of the traditional dog training methods that might include using a correction procedure where you use something like an ear pinch or a shock or a choke, or right. These are less. Not only was there an emphasis on not using those procedures, but also not as effective with an animal that can just swim away from you and you can't readily run behind it, or swim behind it in this case. But there was still a need to deal with some of these behaviors that might otherwise interfere with training. And in that process, that seems to be where the L.R.S was born. So it was very quickly. So I know the L.R.S can encompass a lot of things, but there seems to be two big components of the L.R.S. So we can break it down in terms of two major event sequences, which the first is, so you see some response that that is problematic, so some undesired response, and you pause for several seconds, typically 2 to 3 seconds. Historically, it's been, it may be more than 2 to 3 seconds, but often the description is 2 to 3 seconds of a pause. That's described as a mini pause or a micro pause. So that's the first part of the sequence, is you pause. And then the second part is when you then get desired behavior in some sense. So this calm response, something associated with being calm. The animal is, the dolphin is waiting patiently at some level. Again, all these things we would need to define what we mean here, or be particular about the behaviors. But so you're getting something associated with calm behavior, and then you do something to allow the animal to receive a reward. In some cases, it may just be you directly reward the calm response. It seems more typical that the second part of the sequence is you allow the animal to choose a behavior, or you specifically cue another response. Some of the procedures, for instance, the way that Ken Ramirez often talks about the procedure, he'll cue a response that's already well known. So he'll cue some previously trained response that's well established, and then reward that response. But the important part is the training then continues. So the training, so it's pause, this several second pause, and then allow the animal to re-enter the training session to engage in responses that receive rewards.
Right.
And that can continue to occur.
Yeah.
Right.
When you say this in again, is the things that we call to time in, no?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's an important, so it seems to be there's two important components, which is there is a cost, the response cost component for this undesired behavior. So the dolphin does the incorrect response, or you cue a response, or you may not even have cued a response. You just may be sitting there and the dolphin turns away from you, or the dolphin even engages in something you really don't want to. The dolphin goes to move up towards you, or engage in some response that is not helpful for the training session. So it's an undesired response, and you pause. So you engage in that 2 to 3 second pause. Now, as you mentioned, that's been described as extinction in some conditions. This is the problem with describing that. So first off, a very important component here. So there is a problem with describing that as extinction, but there's also a very important feature of contingencies, defining contingencies in general, which is that they are defined functionally, meaning they are defined by, as I talked about before, by the effect they have on behavior. So in all of this, we have to keep in mind that whether something is defined as reinforcement or punishment or extinction all depends on what, not just how it's implemented, but what occurs to the behavior. So the problem with the extinction definition is that extinction is defined in an operant sense as simply the removal of a reinforcement contingency. That's it. So that response was previously in the laboratory. So the old Skinnerian studies that were done, that would simply mean key pecking was being, this pigeon was pecking on a key, and that key, when they would peck on the key on maybe some schedule of reinforcement, or we can say every time they peck the key, so they receive a reward, or every 5 times they peck the key, they receive a reward. Now we stop delivering the reward for pecking the key, and key pecking goes down. That is an extinction condition or an extinction schedule.
Right.
In this case, so if the dolphin engages in some behavior, so say the dolphin turns away from you during a training session, and you give a several second pause, or the dolphin engages in the incorrect behavior. To describe that as extinction doesn't really work if that behavior wasn't previously maintained by the reward that you are no longer delivering. That's the only way you can describe that as an extinction condition. So it's not to say that there aren't some times that may describe part of the procedure, that there may be a component of this that is extinction. Sometimes I would suspect it's pretty rare though, because what appears to be more common that's happening, if we're seeing a reduction in the behavior that this mini pause or micro pause is following, is that what you have done is remove the animal for several seconds from the ability to receive reinforcement. And that's really the key component. So that's not, those reinforcers weren't previously, or most likely not previously, maintaining that particular response. And the animal, that pause has the effect of removing the animal from the ability, not removing them physically. The animal is still there. You are not moving, right? You are still there, but you have stopped the ability from the animal to receive reinforcement for for several seconds.
Right. So doctor, we can define extinction as the elimination of a reinforcement contingency, right?
Yeah.
This is right. I have in here the book of Ken Ramirez, the animal training. In the chapter 4, the basic operant conditioning, Ken say, a technique used successfully by many facilities is referred to a 3 to 5 seconds no response or neutral response. In 1991, 𝐿.R.S. and his colleagues of SeaWorld wrote about the application in this principle in decreasing the frequency of the behavior through extinction. Although it's impossible to provide a truly neutral response, the idea is to come as close to the neutral response as possible at the point where reinforcement normally will be given. During the training session, as trainer, it's quite impossible to intervene in the session and in the contingents without modifying the contingents. What do you think is the particular function of the L.R.S. in a series of the reinforcement events? Does the L.R.S. extinguish, modify, or how acting on the cited behavior?
Yeah. So as I was mentioning, it's likely, again, the function is determined by the effect on behavior and also how it's implemented. So it's likely not an extinction procedure or condition or schedule, because that, the thing that is being withheld was not what was previously maintaining the behavior. That's the definition of extinction. Instead, the animal is, and I say this, not physically removed, but the animal is still being removed from the ability to receive reinforcement within this condition of where it's at. And if we then see a decrease in that behavior, that meets every functional contextual definition of a timeout, what would be called a non-exclusion timeout procedure. So we see this, the animal is removed from the ability to receive reinforcement for several seconds. And it's not removed from the environment. The trainer doesn't move. The trainer doesn't remove the dolphin. That's what defines it as non-exclusion. Because I think what most people think of when they think of timeout is they think of exclusion timeouts, as Cooper, Heron, and Heward in their applied behavior analysis text would define non-exclusion versus exclusion. Most people think of exclusion timeout meaning you send, the child does something that you don't want them to do, you send them to the corner, you send them to a chair in the corner. And here, so that's what's called an exclusion timeout. You remove them physically from the environment. And then the second component that people often think of it for a timeout is that it lasts for some extended period of time, often several minutes. But that is not part of the definition of a timeout. So this is part of I think what creates some confusion is that people say, hey, this is only 2 to 3 seconds or 3 to 5 seconds, and therefore it's not a timeout. The functional definition of timeout doesn't matter how long the animal has been removed from the ability to receive reinforcement, just that we see a reduction in the future occurrence of that behavior as a result of this condition. So as a result of the timeout period, that cannot be explained by extinction.
Yeah.
So because it's not just a removal of the reinforcement contingency that was maintaining the behavior.
Right.
So
𝐿.𝐷.𝐒 say in the book of the L.R.S, he say, when used to alleviate the frustration that may be associated with the incorrect response, the L.R.S is being used as a differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, or DRA. Within the session, contrary to the anxiety, frustration is easily found, easily observable in the marine mammals. When we observe frustration, we can consider the frustration part of the contingency of the session, or perhaps it's only a result of that contingency, doctor.
Yeah, it's not. So one of the things I say about, again, and this is going to be me giving a academic response, a very behavior analytic response to this.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I say about frustration, when we talk about frustration, we need to know what behaviors, what are the observable, measurable behaviors we're talking about when we say frustration. But I get this. So I just want to be clear that we're on the same page, that we know what we're talking about, we're looking at, because if for no other reason, I am far less educated, far less informed, far less knowledgeable about dolphin behavior than you or many of your listeners are. So I've only worked on one project with bottlenose dolphins.
All right.
And that's the only cetacean I've ever worked with. So it's worth keeping that in mind. Is that my knowledge of just even normal dolphin behavior, and what might account for quote unquote frustrated dolphin behavior, isn't that great. So it would at least help me, if not get us all on the same page, to define what we mean in terms of observable behavior. So that's the first part, is we need to know what we're talking about when to make sure we're all on the same page when we say this is the frustrated behavior. But then beyond that, when we start to see a lot of the behaviors that we typically don't want to see in a training session, that often has to do a lot with things like the rate of reinforcement. So that's where we start to see some of the breakdown in where our training is going. So we're not delivering enough a high enough rate of reinforcement to keep behavior going. This is part of what in behavior analytic terms we might call ratio strain. So that the amount of work that the animal has to engage in to get one reward or several rewards or whatever may be too strong, too large, that they stop performing the behavior. Now, in that sense, we are talking about extinction. That's what ratio strain describes, is extinction. So there may be that extinction component involved there. But the important point here is that we're trying to get the animal back on pace to doing things that do get rewards and increasing that rate of reinforcement. So getting more rewards for the things that we want. And that's part of where the L.R.S, again, as a treatment package, may be helpful, in that we are, instead of spending so much time focusing on something that we did not want to see, we're giving several seconds to allow the animal to direct itself to a behavior that will be rewarded, which is these behaviors associated with calm responses, right? So waiting, not moving for a couple seconds, not vocalizing, however we're going to describe, however we're going to define this calm set of behaviors. And then being, some aspect of that continues where they start to receive rewards a bunch more. And as I mentioned, this is a fairly quick process, right? When I've seen the L.R.S implemented correctly, it's done very quickly. It's hey, here's a brief pause, trainer doesn't move, trainer doesn't leave, and the trainer's back to giving out rewards. So see, we're keeping rate of reinforcement really high. And that's where I think there's an important emphasis on that overall rate of reinforcement on top of everything else for helping minimize any of this potential quote unquote frustration.
Yeah, right. Like you say, it's really easy to see the L.R.S. And if it's made good, if they made properly, it's really clear, and it's really clear how to do it for the animals. I used the L.R.S for a long time, and in different species, in dogs, in sea lions, in camels, and elephants, and all the time works.
Yeah.
I have in here, like you say, the two parts of the L.R.S. and the animal training philosophy of the SeaWorld and Busch gardens. And they say exactly this: the L.R.S has two parts. The first part is a consequence of incorrect behavior. This occurs when the trainer does not reinforce the animal in the correct behavior. The second part is the stimulus providing an opportunity for reward. For 2 to 3 seconds, the trainer is related and attempts to not change the environment. We can consider this objective to the L.R.S, and the success to the L.R.S always depends to this subsequent time in, or have a all the time success because the differential reinforcements for alternative behavior, or we can call the L.R.S differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, doctor?
Well, so there's potentially a differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, or incompatible, or some aspect of a DRA or DRI or the like, that may, for this second component. But there's some interesting differences. I won't spend too much time talking about these. The one thing I do want to say is that we're talking about a sequential, so a chain of events that occur. So there's first the pause, and then the rewarding of behavior. Now, that rewarding of behavior is always occurring at some differential, in some differentially reinforced level, right? You're not just rewarding everything that's occurring.
Yeah.
So there's going to be some level of differential reinforcement in that second sequence. But that first sequence, the pause given for the incorrect behavior, that would not be correct to describe that as being differentially reinforced. Well, it's not in the way that it's being described. So let's leave that. So the important component there, it seems in many cases, is the fact that This is a consequence, this event, this timeout condition that is imposed on as a result of this incorrect response through this several second pause. But I understand. So that's what I wanted to simply say about differential reinforcement. I think what's important is to emphasize, and I understand completely, the emphasis on the reinforcement component, which is like all reinforcement conditions, does involve differential reinforcement. So we could effectively, that second component, describe it as a DRA, or differential reinforcement in general. I would more loosely describe it as just it's a reinforcement condition. We can say it's differentially reinforced, as all reinforcement conditions are. And emphasizing that second component is important, because that's another feature that doesn't get talked about with the L.R.S. enough as is that as this treatment package, we want to see a lot more reinforcement than we are seeing pausing, right?
Right.
That's a really important component there, is that the pausing, if I were to see an L.R.S. procedure implemented, or multiple of these procedures implemented, where somebody just kept pausing, and there's not a lot of rewards occurring, I would say, hey, we need to do less pausing and more reinforcing of correct responses. We need to get that rate of reinforcement up, because that's at this point where it looks like the problem is, where we're getting some of this breakdown. And that's actually a really important component of just using any form of reductive procedure. Any timeout or anything, is the organism is telling you through their behavior when you are not doing the correct job at training. It's not the organism's fault. It's you are the training procedure is breaking down.
Yeah,
right.
This is exactly the point for 𝐿.𝐷. Many of the times to the L.R.S. didn't work is because the application for the trainers, and as well in other parts of the training. In general, the marine mammal industry does not justify the use to punish as an option for reduced behavior, for decrease the undecided behavior. Doesn't matter if they punish words or not. We don't use it for ethical reasons, no? However, the exclusive ethical considerations about the L.R.S. do not depend about it is an effective and modified behavior. Also, on consequences such as frustration, as the L.R.S. is the last restrictive, and if we can call human techniques for reduce this. I mean, something happened some years ago in one class about the L.R.S. with one trainer who always is the mind is working a lot. We speak about the L.R.S. is a proactive procedure to is looking for reduce the aggressions and the punish is option against to the punish. He asked me if SeaWorld is make this for a long time, and if the application is correct, is not coming to the frustration and the aggression, why still the aggressions in SeaWorld? And this was interesting question. Obviously, the first reaction to is to say is the application, the wrong application, or something happened. No? Do you have opinion about how impact the words punish and reinforcement in these new generations of aquariums and zoos trainers and keepers?
Yeah, so this is part of, this is the discussion that I really like to have about talking about the L.R.S. and talking about the procedures we use in general, because I think this is a really important discussion. As I've spent a lot of time talking about here, when I use the term punishment, I am talking strictly from a behavior analytic operant conditioning perspective. I mean, we can talk about punishment in other learned, non-operant senses as well. But I'm not. I'm interested right now in this, in using the traditional behavior analytic definition as it's applied to operant punishment, which again, we're talking about a consequence that follows some response and leads to a reduction in the future occurrence of that response. That is not simply an elimination of the reinforcement contingency, because that's extinction. So we're specifically talking about punishment. And timeouts are a form of negative punishment, in that in this case, the animal is removed from the ability to receive reinforcement for X period of time. Either they are physically removed or they are not able to get reinforcement within that environment. But they cannot receive reinforcement. So all of this said, these are all parts of the contingencies that occur in everyday life, in all everything that's going on. There are times when I say the use of the term punishment itself, I think the baggage that it brings to the table is problematic. I don't think that was done necessarily accidentally. I don't know enough about the history of the use of the term or why that was incorporated, but I can tell you that many behavior analysts, for good reason, so for many behaviorists, for good reason. So we're going on close to a century of arguments made against using, minimizing the use of punishment, the use of aversive conditioning as much as possible. Skinner, B.F. Skinner, spent quite a lot of time in his books, like Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and about behaviorism, and even in his fictional work of Walden 2, spent quite a bit of time talking about the ills of a society that tends to emphasize the use of aversive conditioning for training. Murray Sidman wrote a book called Coercion and Its Fallout, which is a fantastic book. Murray Sidman being probably the most well-versed person on the use of negative reinforcement in the laboratory. This was the guy who he created a procedure called Sidman avoidance. So he spent day in, day out for years imposing shock schedules to get rats to press levers to avoid shocks, to escape or avoid shocks, all of what's defined as negative reinforcement. And he wrote a book following much of this laboratory work saying, here's why it's terrible how much society relies on the use of aversive conditioning. And we all see this. We know, every one of us knows those trainers. We know those people. I mean, we see people like I'll throw out one name in particular because it's an easy one to throw out, but we see people like Cesar Millan, right? Who go out there and they're ear pinching and they're doing all these crazy traditional training description, all the things, you have to dominate the dog, you have to do this, all of it is based on aversive conditioning procedures. So it's easy to see why, so much that. Similarly, I'll give another example. I mean, all of our lives are controlled by so many aversive conditions, right? I mean,
when's the last, humans,
when's the last time any of us were pulled over by a police officer, and the police officer came to the window, tapped on the window, and said, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know you were doing a really great job driving. That's all. See ya." Right? No, almost the entire purpose of a police officer is to dish out punishers, right? Yeah. They're looking to punish responding at a grand level. So, because society in general relies heavily on aversive control, we've seen this shift away, fortunately, in both, in education, in parenting, and now within animal training procedures over the past several decades. I mean, I can tell you the way that, you know, I was raised as a kid is far different than the way kids are raised today, right? And that's a very good thing, because my parents relied on a lot of not paying attention to me until I did the thing that they didn't want me doing, and then, you know, that's when some of the punishers came about, right? So, and I had very traditional Cuban parents, so
Right.
some of the punishers were pretty severe. Um, but so that said, uh, you know, it's easy to understand why we want to then talk about punishment itself in a very black and white context and say, oh, and that's why we don't use punishment, and that's why punishment is bad, and reinforcement is always better than punishment, etc. But there's a lot of gray there. So that's an important part. And we still have, so we are still all at some level reliant on punishment, on negative reinforcement in our lives. I mean, we're all still using alarm clocks, right? We all have different schedules that we impose on ourselves for what we eat, when we eat, where we eat it. And there are many behavior analysts that have written about this philosophically too, as to say that, listen, we can't just treat this as a black and white issue, that it's this is always better than that. And I can impose many reinforcement conditions that are so I can say, hey, you know what? Okay, well, I'm only going to use positive reinforcement to train. But what I'm going to do is restrict every possible response that the animal can do, except for the thing I want. So I'm gonna keep them in a very, I mean, look, pigeons in the laboratory, rats in the laboratory are put inside a box, and it's almost exclusively positive reinforcement that's used to control the lever, the key pecking in pigeons, or the lever pressing in rats. But I would hardly say those are the most that overall that's the most beneficial to the organism. There's very little to do in that box other than peck the key or press the lever for those studies, for good reason. And the rewards itself are not, you know, it's sugar pellets in many cases for rats. It's grain that's part of a normal diet for pigeons, and they may have to get part of their diet by doing that work.
Right.
Even in those conditions, when we talk about other effects, so we can talk about contra freeloading and things like that, they're under very deprived environments. These are not, if you took, I'm saying something that's a little harsh about laboratory procedures in general, but I will tell you, as somebody who's done laboratory training with pigeons and rats, who's used operant conditioning principles and other learning, done other learning studies with both in the laboratory. If I walked into somebody's home and saw them have a dog, you know, under the conditions, under, you know, here's how I do my training. I'm going to put them in this box, and then the dog only has this one response that they can engage in, and then I'm going to deliver a reward. And by the way, all of this meets the definition of positive reinforcement. I would say, let's call animal control. We need to get this dog out of this person's house, because that is not ethical for how to
Right.
train that animal.
Sure.
Laboratory conditions are not the most ethical for how we should be treating animals outside of these laboratory. I know I'm opening a can of worms here by saying, look, many laboratory conditions are you have to work with what you deal with.
Yeah.
So, but that said, um, that's these things are not black and white. We can create conditions where reinforcement is not ideal, the most ethical in how it's applied. We can create conditions where punishment ends up being a far more ethical procedure than than just only focusing on what we want to reward. And so what I like to say about the L.R.S. and that first non-exclusion timeout component that seems to be, for most cases, in the a functional component of that mini or micro pause, it's also one of the cleanest, most effective, least coercive ways in which I've ever seen any type of timeout, let alone punishment, implemented to reduce unwanted behavior. And even if we could determine what was maintaining that behavior, so even if we found out that it was some level of attention that we gave, or it was automatically reinforced by the animal engaging in that behavior, the undesired behavior that we wanted to get rid of, it would probably be more time consuming and as a result less ethical to actually use extinction rather than these non-exclusion timeouts to reduce that behavior. And it would also stop the animal from being able to get more rewards through all this training. So I think that's a really, really important component. So that's part of why I like to talk about the fact that there's timeout involved in punishment, is because we need to acknowledge when we do use punishment and negative reinforcement and other what we typically associate with aversive control, and acknowledge, why is this not the same as what we might describe under other conditions? Why is this different than? So they're not all the same. Using a timeout is not the same thing as screaming or hitting or a consequence that might otherwise be punishing for some response, right? Shocking, choking, they're light years different.
Yeah, the positive punish. Yeah. True.
Yeah, they're light years different, and we need to take those into consideration, which is what behavior analysts have done for decades. The behavior analysts have talked about least restrictive procedures, because then we are not so least restrictive, and in some also talked about most effective. So least restrictive, most effective. So I'm going back to Van Houten in the 80s wrote a paper on most effective treatment, right to most effective treatment. Johnston and Sherman in 93 wrote a paper on the least restrictive alternative. Behavior analysts have been talking about using least restrictive procedures for decades. And I think it's the most I think it's the most relevant way to talk about the ethics of training and how we effectively and ethically train animals, because to treat different contingencies is, well, this one's just better than that one. So always use positive reinforcement over negative reinforcement, and always use negative reinforcement over negative punishment, and those are always better. That's not an effective way to determine the ethics of our procedures. I can punch holes in that all day long to say it that way. If you tell me, well, I know I'm the most ethical because I'm a positive reinforcement trainer, and I know that guy is the least ethical because he admits to using punishment, I can punch holes in that all day long. That's not a great way to tell me. I mean, I only use positive reinforcement, but every one of my animals is food deprived to 70-80% of its free feeding weight, and they exist in a tiny box.
So and you're right, like humans or animals live surrender about the reinforcement and sometimes punish. The animal behavior is modified for continued interaction with the trainer and the environment, and this interaction determines the mental status, the mental state of the animals. When the punish comes or occurs involuntary, there is no so much to do it. No, this is one of the points too I like so much about the L.R.S. Is make the trainer aware to detect that situation, and is try to improve the conditions for immediately next time. This is the really
absolutely
good thing about the L.R.S. One thing to Ħ.𝐷.𝐒 tell us in the conversation we have with him, this is the really good thing for the L.R.S. And obviously the no restrictions and no limitations for animals and for the trainers, because the trainers is open a big picture of possibilities for the animal to be reinforced. All right, the places to don't want to use the word timeout in relation with the L.R.S. as well. We can understand because our times is no easy, especially for the media and all these positions and all these ambientalist things too is involved some industries, in particular for the zoos, for the home animals, and especially for the marine mammals. Entonces, if the concept L.R.S. is as well no aggressive for the outdoors for our industry, let's use it. But it's important, like you say, to not only understand for the trainers and the keepers to apply the L.R.S. and to know the L.R.S. is not the tool, but it's the main tool for reduce this on the survey behavior. But is fundamental to they knows where come from the L.R.S. and what is the L.R.S. Doesn't matter how we can call or if we don't want to call in front of the visitors or other people timeout. In conclusion, Doc, do you want to say something more?
No, I've already had a lot of words to say. So I generally I think that's a typical thing for me is to always have lots of words to say. So I appreciate having this outlet to say lots of words. This is fantastic, and I've really enjoyed this. So.
Thank you very much, Doc. I hope so. You spend good time. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope so. Sometimes we can talk about other kind of concept in the animal analysis behavior. It was a truly pleasure, Doc.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Anytime. I'm always happy to talk about animal behavior. That's one thing that I'll never get satiated on.
That's right. We're gonna keep your contacts and your social media links and in the description of the video. And as well, thank you, everybody out there for following this conversation. Happy training. Thank you very much.